Alrighty, welcome to the last class in the series. I'm a little bit under the weather here, but not so bad that it'll cause any problems, so just to let you know. This is the last class. If you have any questions, this is the time to run them by me. And of course, you can always, if you have questions after the course is over, you're welcome to contact me personally on my through my email, which is on my website, raygrasse.com. At any rate, what I wanted to do here was wrap up and try to kind of tie it together in a certain respect. And but I want to begin by recapping a couple things from last week, adding a couple of points to what we talked about last week. I was going over some possible meditation regimen outlines, one in particular. And I remembered a quote that I often like to use, and I forgot to mention it last week. You see, Krishnamurti, who actually broke ground on the building I'm sitting in right now back in 26 or so, very, very interesting man, well worth reading. But he made a comment once, he said, more than once actually, he said something to the effect that meditation techniques subvert the awakening process because they put your mind into pre-existing grooves in a way which kind of, it sabotages that organic awakening process, which is fine when you're Krishnamurti and you've had a spontaneous enlightenment experience. And some people have that, where at a certain age, sometimes at 5 years old, sometimes at 90 years old, a person without ever doing meditation will suddenly have an enlightenment experience. There's many, many experiences and accounts like that in the literature. And usually you can bet that those are people that probably had quite a momentum from past lives as far as meditating. That just doesn't happen out of the blue like that. There's got to be some kind of karmic backlog of momentum going towards that. But I think that Krishnamurti was wrong on that point. And there's a great quote that I think sums it up nicely, which is, you may have heard it, it's, enlightenment is an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. And that's very true. And it's kind of like, Mozart was an innate genius in a lot of ways, and yet he had to learn the scales like everybody else. He just didn't sit down and start composing masterpieces. Same with Bach or Beethoven. They had to learn the scales. They didn't start out writing masterpieces. They learned the basics, and once they had subsumed those basics into their unconscious, they were able to leap off into that, creative stratosphere. So in any event, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have some kind of meditation regimen going, some sort of technique, some sort of pattern. And it may happen if you have an awakening. It may happen in between. You may do a technique for 3 hours and then you stop it, and that's when the experience happens. That's one of the reasons why I emphasize that third stage so much of, do we need to? Okay. It's one of the reasons why I emphasize the weightlessness metaphor of being in space. When you've done a technique, you should always spend a certain amount of time, Kriyananda felt, the equal amount of time spent in pure silence of non-thematic sitting, themeless sitting, you might say, as you did with a technique, as you did with the meditation proper in terms of whatever it is that you were doing. So take that for what that's worth. And in terms of techniques, I mentioned how if you don't know what to do and you're feeling that you don't know how to get into a regimen or you don't want to, I said that you could just meditate on love. And you could even, for that matter, something I forgot to mention was, you could even just chant the word love over and over again. If you chant that for a half hour, it will, like when I said last week about chanting the word coffee when I was a kid, it'll soon become nonsensical, but there are those unconscious associations with love. Hopefully, in your case, not all, bad, because some people have that, I suppose, but, chanting something that means a meaningful sort of feeling to you. They say it's ideal if you do a mantra that is so-called sacred from India or in the Hebrew system, for example, but that's not necessarily true. I've had very interesting experiences with techniques that were not formally sort of from the canon. Anyway, and if you have any questions about meditation or techniques like that, feel free to jump in here while I'm talking. Another thing that I was talking about last week was maybe the single most important thing in terms of the mystical life is attitude. It's more important than any exotic technique or metaphysical scheme because your attitude is something you carry with you 24 hours a day. And what I neglected to mention was it's not just a matter of having a positive attitude for the sake of moving through life in a pleasant sort of fashion. It's about your attitude determines it's the state of mind that you hold, the frequency you attune to, determines your incoming reality in terms of crystallizing in your reality. If a person is going around, if I can put it this way, chanting negative thoughts, negative mantras like I'm a loser or it's never going to work or whatever it might be, that in a sense really does generate a certain reality that's different from a more positive attitude, which then in turn affects your post-life state. Where you go when you pass on in terms of your astral life is affected by your attitude throughout this life. And in turn, your next lifetime, your next incarnation. So the attitudinal perspective, the attitude you bring to your everyday life isn't just important in terms of every moment of the day. It's important in terms of almost as an investment into the future and the path you're magnetizing in. Not to the extreme of The Secret, which is kind of extreme and somewhat nonsensical. There's a certain New Age attitude that if I think positive thoughts, nothing bad will ever happen to me. And I've literally heard people say that. Fortunately, not too much in recent years, but that was a big meme for a while. And that's an extremely simplistic attitude that doesn't take into account cycles and karma. For example, winter sets in and the gardener says, well, I'm going to think positive thoughts and winter's going to go away. Well, right now we're not having too much luck with that. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying by that. Now let's move on to the next point here, which is I want to begin by talking a little bit about what I call the anatomy of the self. And what I mean by that is that esotericists like Shelley and Kriyananda and Yogananda, it wasn't some simplistic scheme in terms of, well, there's spirit and soul. There's consciousness, and that's all there is. What Shelley used to talk about, which was very interesting, was heavily influenced by the Kabbalistic. Shelley was not hooked on any one system. He brought the best of what he got from the different systems that he studied, whether it be Kabbalah or magic or Kriya Yoga or Sufism or quantum physics for that matter. We're even going to get into that a little bit, maybe just a tiny bit. But the point is that he used to make the comment that when you try to get into the basics of consciousness, you can't reduce it any less than 4 components. But there's 2 in particular that I want to begin with here, and that is the observer and the observed. This is a very famous symbol in the esoteric literature, the Ouroboros. And it's the snake eating its own tail. And in most symbolism books, there's a very simplistic, I think simplistic interpretation that usually talks about it being a symbol of eternity, a symbol of infinity, which is not wrong. It's just that it doesn't get into the real essence of what this symbol truly conveys, which is the notion of the self viewing itself, the way Shelley put it in esoteric terms. And that's the sun and the moon, the male and female principle, the observed and the observed. He said the self is a one that eternally functions as a two. In other words, well, let me go to one more step here. The self must forever eat of the self to sustain the self. That's a very mystical statement. This idea that the self must eternally reflect on its own nature. It's almost like a perpetual motion device, an organic perpetual motion device. It's always reflected on itself. It always will. And there's a more complex quote that I want to read here. Hopefully you can see this. Whoa. Did we lose the... there we go. Oh, I see. Okay. This is a longer quote of Shelley's that goes into it in a little more cryptic detail. The self must forever meditate upon the self, contemplate its own nature, that is, in order to sustain the self. It's through this act of self-reflection that the self not only regenerates its own existence, but all the existences of which it is aware, which is an interesting idea. Simply by being aware of something, you affect it. It has always done so and will forever do so. For were the self to ever cease meditating upon itself, it would cease to be. And if this could happen unto one's own spiritual being, it could happen unto all. And in the infinities of existence, if it could happen to one, it would have already happened unto all, and you would not now be here listening to this. It's almost a comical sort of twist there at the end. And it's, I think, a truly profound idea that you see in some of these esoteric, if not the majority of esoteric writings, this idea of the self was a unity that broke into two. No, the self always was a one, camouflaged as a two, you might say. In other words, when you look at yourself, is there a one or a two? It's a one, but it's also a two. You know, there's this peculiar paradox about that self observation quality. And I liken it to looking at yourself in a mirror. Is there a one or a two? Well, there's the viewer and there's the viewed, and in a certain weird way, Shelley used to talk about there becomes a confusion as to who's really looking at who. The observer starts looking at the observed, and the observed starts looking at the observer, and it sets up an ohm. He said it generates, there's a vibration that goes back and forth in that process. Om of the self viewing the self. It's the eternal Om that underlies all existence. There's another picture here that conveys it. It's almost like if you put two mirrors in front of each other. There's this infinite regress is the term they use. In a sense, that describes the self in a way. It's how the self generates infinity, how God, in a sense, generates existence in a very profound sort of fashion. It's a term that I've heard used is the binary self, the one that eternally functions as a two. And if you go into quantum physics, there is an idea that was put forward by a scientist named John Archibald Wheeler, a well-known scientist, and he had an idea called the participatory universe. And he used the U to symbolize, let me get the arrow going here. Whoops, wrong one. That's up here I want to go. Okay, there we go. The U represents universe, okay? And the I represents one part of the universe looking at the other. That's us. And although he meant it in some sort of scientific sense, Shelley would say this is not a bad diagram for the self. The self being the I am aware that I am principle. And going on here, it's an idea in quantum physics. The observer is not separate from the object observed. You know, in other words, this woman here, presuming it's a woman, she's the observed and the flower is the observed. The observer is the sun, the observed is the moon. But in a sense, the flower is also looking at the observer, at the woman. It goes both ways. There's this symbiosis in our experience. You know, you are entwined with the world. You're not separate from the world. And it's in sacred geometry, it's this idea that we spoke about that the symbolism of pi represents that quality to some extent, because you have the circle represents the self, it represents the universe, and there's you off on the one end looking at you. They're both you, but there seems to be a duality there. So it's a unity that masquerades as a duality. And the Kabbalistic way that Shelley used to talk about this, which we're going to get to a little bit later, and it was in that first poem that I read in the first class of Shelley's, of countenance beheld countenance and knew not that it beheld countenance. What is countenance? Countenance is the observer, you might say. It's consciousness. It's the microcosm, looking out at the macrocosm, and so you see this world outside of you and you think that it's not you. That's countenance beholds countenance and does not know that it's beholding itself. And in a state of samadhi, in a state of balance, you have those two come together, and that's where the diameter represents a balanced point. I can't get into much of the sacred geometry here because it gets into all the angles. In other words, if you take, the sun here represents the 0 degree point on the wheel. Well, you've got the 30 degree angle from that point. You've got the 60 degree, the 90 degree, the 120 degree, the 150 degree. You have all these different angles on the wheel. And then you've got that line across, which is more or less the balance point, the sushumna, the center of the spine. And the way Shelley would sometimes talk about it is, how did unity split into duality? Well, that's what most of the esoteric writings talk about, and yet it's not really accurate, at least from what I've understood in the traditions, because in a sense there always was the duality, but it gave rise to different permutations. Now let's move on to the next level, though, and this is, by the way, the Shiva Lingam in India is a representation of the merging in the masculine and feminine. Notice that it is a circle. Whoops, let's get that arrow back. There's the circle representing the diameter of the feminine principle, and there's the shaft in the middle which represents the masculine principle, which is the diameter, you might say. It's the perfection of pi in sacred geometry. All right? Now, going on to the next level here. But Shelley said that it's more complex than that. It's really 4 parts, not 2. Because you not only have the self viewing the self, you've got the act of observing. It's like the old quote of, I think it was Rumi, something to the effect of how a piece of bread looks depends on how hungry you are. The act of observation is a 3rd component, and there's a 4th component, which Shelley talked about as the memory tract. In other words, every experience you have is a shift of consciousness. And that goes into your own memory banks, because your memory is a component of who you are. You don't simply exist in the present. And so you look at the 4-lettered name of God in Kabbalah, and notice that 2 of the letters are the same, okay? IHVH. And I think it might be IHVH. I'm not sure which of these represents which letter, so forgive me for that. So 2 of the letters are the same. That is the self viewing the self. Because when the self views itself, they're both the same thing. And so when you look at the Old Testament, when Moses goes up to the mountaintop, I opened with a beautiful painting of Ernst Fuchs, a Viennese painter, I believe it is, who did that gorgeous painting of Moses in the burning bush. This is Marc Chagall, obviously, and here is Moses before the burning bush, and what do you see up there? You see the 4-lettered name of God. In other words, Moses goes to the mountaintop, which is an esoteric way of saying Moses became enlightened. He went up the path of Sushumna, the highway to the infinite, and he confronts the 4-lettered name of God, which is he confronts the mystery of being. He confronts the mystery of his own being and godly being, being itself. And so the 4-lettered name of God represents that supreme mystery. And you go into the Bible, for instance, and you get this idea of the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac relating to the 4-lettered name of God and relating to the 4 apostles or evangelists. And this is a famous Christian depiction that you see in the New Testament. And here you see, again, it's the 4 creatures that represent there's the bull, there's, well, I guess that's a lion, there's the eagle, and there's the man or angel. And there's a great mystery behind this. What are the 4 creatures of the zodiac? Why? And this is off of Chartres Cathedral. It's not the best reproduction, but again, you can see there's Christ in the middle. And there's the angel, there's, well, whatever that is. I think that's the lion, that's the bull, and there's the eagle. And then you go back to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel, you see those 4 creatures it was the Ezekiel's wheel, a UFO, which is what you see in a lot of the literature these days, and you have for quite a long time, actually. But the thing that leads me to think it wasn't a UFO that he was describing is you have these four creatures that are connected to this vision of the four fixed signs of the zodiac. So this goes way back. I tried to find some dating on how ancient that is with Ezekiel, and and to see whether it came before they were in Babylon, the Jews were in Babylon, and it's a little uncertain, but apparently they got those zodiacal images from Babylon, possibly. But so what do those four elements, and this is from Revelations, by the way, I've got this off the internet, the throne of God attended by the four astrological figures. In the middle of the throne and all around it were four living creatures. The first living creature was like a lion, the second like a bull, the third living creature had a human face, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. This is an uncanny sort of recurrence of symbolism. And then you go a little bit further, and lo and behold, you see this same symbolism, if I can get the arrow to work. Oh, that's another depiction. I think that might be Enoch going up. I'm not sure which. That's a painting by Raphael, gorgeous painting. But the tarot, what do you see here in the four corners? You see the eagle, you see the angel, you see the bull, and you see the lion. That's on the world card, but you also see it, let's see. Yeah, I'm going the wrong way here. You also see it in the Wheel of Fortune card, those four creatures again. So what does that represent? It's the four elements relate to those four parts of consciousness. And even Carl Jung talked about the importance of the four in individuation. I don't know where he got that, whether it was from his own research or whether he got the notion of the quaternary as being so critical to individual awareness and consciousness. Whether he got that from the esoteric traditions or not, I suppose we could find that out. But look at the four elements, and you have earth, water, air, fire. Fire seems to be the observing principle. It's the only self-illuminated element, the only one that is light-bearing, so therefore it represents spirit or the I am principle. Water is the reflective principle. It represents that which reflects awareness. Air is the mediating principle. It's like Hermes, the messenger between worlds. It represents that sense of communication between the self and the not-self. And the bowl represents earth. That represents the wealth of the memory track. Was there something you were going to say, Meredith?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I froze and...
Okay. Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay.
No, the sound was starting up again.
Okay, that's fine. No problem. You could possibly say that air is the observing principle and water is the mediating principle. There could be some debate about that, but the point is the four elements relate to those four basic parts of consciousness. And the point of mysticism is to balance these out. So we go to the next image, which is from my book, The Waking Dream. And you see these four creatures symbolically representing the 4 points of the base of the pyramid. And what do we have at the top? We have something called the tetramorph. It's not really the Sphinx, though it is related to the Sphinx. The Sphinx in Egypt, as we normally see it, has the head of a person and the body of a lion, and some people believe there may have been wings of some sort on the Sphinx at one time, or maybe wings were represented by a set of fire pits alongside the Sphinx. We don't know for sure. But the tetramorph is an image that goes quite a ways back that combines those four creatures of the bull, the eagle, the lion, and the angel, the person. And you bring them together, you balance those four parts of consciousness into one, and you get samadhi. That is samadhi, when the disparate portions of your nature collapse into a single point, you might say. And that you become the tetramorph. You become the Christ principle, you might say. You become the Buddha principle. And it's an interesting, I think, and this is, by the way, it's interesting how on the dollar bill we have that symbolism of the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid, which represents that the spiritual paracap, the penultimate point of being in balance, pure awareness. But there's a link. I haven't seen this in any books, but I'm sure that others have thought about this, and that is that there's, in symbolism, there's a link between the pyramid shape that I just showed you and the five-pointed star. Because if you look here at this image of the pentagram, which here is a Kabbalistic merger of Christianity and Judaism, but if you look at this image, you have the lower 4 points, which here is interestingly documented as the word Eve, the feminine principle. You have 4 points and capped by the fifth point, Shin, represented by the Shin principle, Adam. So in other words, the 4 points below are the nature principle, the feminine principle. And the fifth point represents the like I said, the paracap, the pinnacle of spiritual awakening. So when you compare that to the pyramid, you really see it's the same principle, the 4 down there and the fifth point up there, the quintessence, the fifth essence in alchemy. Now, any questions about this before we go on to the next level? And so the five-pointed star in the pyramid represents, in a certain sense, the perfected self, the awakened self. All right, let's go on to the next point here. Well, this is again that drawing that I emphasized a lot in the first 2 classes, representing again that perfected self, Adam Kadmon, as well as the archetype. It's the prototype of your potential as well as your perfected self, the five-pointed star, which the human body is a reflection of. Now, what I want to do here is shift gears a little bit. I've laid the foundation here a bit, and I want to go into this poem that I read at the end of the first class, which gives you the big picture. And this is a poem that I learned from Shelley Trimmer, the yogi. And a very profound mystic, and I've read this piece of literature, I don't know, maybe 100 times over the years, and every time I read it, I get something new out of it. And it's the only thing he really put down in writing. And he didn't even give it to anyone. It was found on the floor of his house. So I'm not quite sure if he ever wanted it to be read. I think he did. But again, he was a very profound figure in this. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. The poem that I'm going to read, just to set the stage a little bit for this, it talks about a very non-Vedantic view. In other words, the Vedantic view, like I said before, is the idea that there's just one of us. It's pure non-duality in the sense of behind this drama there is only one of us, and any sense of individuality is an illusion. And Shelley and Yogananda and Kriyananda, for what it's worth, were definitely not of that camp. They were more of the Samkhya Yoga camp, which is there are individuals, there are individual Atmas, in a way that's, I think, very similar to that holographic idea that we talked about of how each part of the holograph is unique and individual at the same time that it reflects the entire, organism, the entire system. It represents both duality and non-duality simultaneously. But the idea that we discussed in that first class was this notion that God is one of us. He's not somehow ontologically higher than us. I mean, in terms of his attainment, yes, his or her attainment. But that we existed in a state that is comparable to chaos as far as, like I asked Shelley once, to elaborate, and he said, the way that atoms, gas molecules in a room are bouncing around. It's not a bad thing, it's just that there's not order. Now, another analogy that I might use is you read these stories about the emperors of old and the kings like Shi Huangdi, the Chinese emperor that unified China. There were all these warring factions where one warlord would rise up and take over a region, then he'd be overthrown, another warlord would rise up, and finally you had a strong, dictator that came in and kind of organized all of these different fiefdoms and brought them together into some unified kingdom civilization. And in a way, that's kind of what Shelley and Yogananda implied about Brahma, about whatever Ra brought order out of chaos in the Egyptian system. This idea there was a being that brought order out of chaos. and that we were drawn into this dream, this cosmic dream, not so much a creation as a dream, you might say. But the beings that existed in this chaos, that existed in this state that he also likened to, in Greek mythology, you have Olympus, you have these godlike beings, and you have the humans down here. He implied you might use Olympus as kind of a metaphor for the state in which we existed before we entered into God's dream. And an analogy that came to mind for me with this was, some of you know Star Trek: The Next Generation, and there was a figure named Q, who was not a normal human. He was from something called the continuum, which was beyond space and time. And he had superhuman powers, and he was timeless. He was an eternal being. In a sense, that's kind of a warped version of what we all are potentially. We all are this being that transcends time and space, and we entered into God's dream. Now let me go ahead and read the poem, then we can go back over some of the points here. Before the beginning, chaos reigned in the infinities. Countenance beheld not countenance in balanced equilibrium. Creation followed creation in unsustained furies, until one brother held forth the vestments of honor. In his essence, the maze of self was solved. In him, countenance beheld countenance in balanced glory. Bliss flowed forth in undulating waves of joy. The sustained spiral of creation hewed forth into being. The brothers flocked to pay homage and obeisance before the Master. The wave of bliss spread unto all, willing that they might sup upon the crystalline dew. They descended into him and moved about the pathways to behold the law of the maze. Brother communicated unto brother the golden essence of truth. Countenance beheld countenance in the splendored visage of balance. Brothers became lost in the maze. Others descended to lend aid. The sustained creation was maintained in balance against the folly of the fallen brothers. Sustained creation shall remain sustained until all brothers and sisters in infinity stand hallowed by the blissful countenance of balanced being. Now, Shelley packed a lot of esoteric information into this short little piece, and he can elaborate on this for days on end, and I almost heard him do that on occasion. As far as this is a super distilled sort of expression of what he felt the cosmology truly was, but I can go over this briefly with you and explain a few of these points. I already have some of them. This idea that the original chaos, the original condition was not balanced. That's something you even have in the Bible, the idea that the Bible does not start with Eden. Eden comes after the original chaos. There comes a point where the God figure sort of brings order out of chaos. And so this, by the way, the language here is very Kabbalistic, more than it is yogic, interestingly. Shelley had a big debt to the, especially the Book of Concealed Mystery. You can find that, it's still in print by MacGregor Mathers. I think the title of the book is called Kabbalah Unveiled. Very mysterious book, and the language is quite similar to this. And so creation followed creation in unsustained furies. Different beings had the capacity to create their own dreams, but they weren't able to sustain them, and they weren't in balance. But along comes this one being, this profound being that somehow, on the infinity of beings, there's one being that was able to balance out the maze of self. The maze of self are the components of your nature that are in chaos and disorder, and when you bring them together in that, like I did with that pyramid with the tetramorph at the top, that's countenance beholding countenance in balanced glory, this idea of the self viewing the self coming together into progressively more balanced states of being. And in that state of balance, bliss flows forth. It's like I described that very minor state of samadhi I had at the Zen monastery. And the only way I knew how to describe it was waves of bliss coming off of me. We'll now magnify that infinitely. And you're talking about a being that is exuding this bliss, this love, this energy, and undulating waves of joy, the sustained spiral of creation. That's a complex line. I don't even want to get into it. But hewed forth into being. The brothers flocked to pay homage and obeisance before them. Like, it's almost like a moth being drawn to a flame, but in a good sense, not in the sense of being extinguished. And you're drawn to that energy, to that beauty, to that love, to that sense of radiance. And the wave of bliss spread unto all, willing that they might sup upon the crystalline dew. Crystalline dew is a Kabbalistic term. I suppose it's similar to terms you find in the yogic tradition about the inner nectar and all this. When you get into an enlightened state, it's like the energy kind of flows down from that. It's like a sweet dew is one of the ways I've heard it described, although there may be other interpretations of that. Let's go on to the next passage here. They descended into him and moved about the pathways to behold the law of the maze. In other words, we're drawn to this extraordinary creation, this dream, and we enter into it, and we learn from it. We learn by moving along God's pathways, so to speak, because we're entering into his memory track, and we're moving along the pathways that he's established through his experience. As he's woven out, he's spun out this extraordinary creation, this extraordinary dream. And brother communicated unto brother the golden essence of truth. Countenance beheld countenance in the splendid visage of balance. Beings learn from this process over eons of time and awaken to their own nature. But like Narcissus staring into the pool and getting lost, brothers became lost in the maze. And as they become lost, it's a snowball effect. Karma builds up. It's almost like you have a hot air balloon and the basket is somehow filling up with more and more ballast. The more karma you generate, the more emotions you generate, and the more soul you develop, the more weight develops, and the more you sink down into the dream. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's an important point that I tried to get across in the first talk when I read the Hymn of the Pearl, that fantastic story from the Coptic tradition. But others descended to lend aid. The sustained creation was maintained in balance against the folly of the fallen brothers. To use a trite analogy, imagine that you're in a school, in a classroom, a grade school, and the kids are totally out of line, and they're throwing things, and they're screaming, and the hall monitor comes in and straightens them out, and he says, look, you can't do this. You're breaking the windows. You're throwing the chairs around. We can't have this. So in other words, you can, according to what Shelley said, you can actually tear the fabric of God's dream because we're in his being. We're in his soul. And things can get too out of hand. And so the higher beings come down to kind of, straighten us out, and not necessarily in a disciplinary sense, but in the sense of teaching. Although I imagine I've heard stories, which I won't go into, about beings of teachers that are fighting a war up on the astral against possibly dark forces, and who knows if those stories are true. But so I think that there may be both. It may be that they try to keep things in balance through limiting beings in certain ways, maybe karmically limiting beings, or by just teaching in some way. Sustained creation shall remain sustained until all brothers in infinity stand hallowed by the blissful countenance of balanced being. In other words, this godlike being, this Brahma, this Ra, this cosmic dreamer, as Shelley and Yogananda used to talk about it, it keeps this dream sustained, which is apparently a unique trait, because until this being came along, no other being was able to sustain their dream. It's one thing to create something, to create a dream. That's nothing, Shelley used to say. Keeping it in balance is the hard part. Anybody can have a dream. It's like Kriyananda opened up a temple, and it was a lot of fun at first, and then it got to be a pain in the rear, and he went to Shelley, and that's when Shelley said, creating is easy. It's keeping things going. It's the hard part. Keeping it going in balance is even harder. Now, but a key point here is hallowed by the blissful countenance of balanced being. It's almost as though, well, it's not almost as though, according to what Shelley and Yogananda and Kriyananda talk about, it is as though this being is exuding love. It's in an unselfish fashion. It's pure love. And Kriyananda talked about an experience when he was first getting into meditation, and a lot of mystics first approach God out of anger. I know that sounds a bit strange to some people, but it's like, why is there so much injustice in the world? And so they go into those higher states to kind of get to the root of existence. It's often injustice or pain or suffering of loved ones that motivates mystics and towards trying to find out the truth. And what Shelley and Kriyananda, and I've heard other teachers talk about it, is what they've often said is that the higher you get, the closer you get to the fringes of God consciousness, the more you are virtually overwhelmed by the blissful love that is exuding from that source, the one, as Plotinus talked about it. And even Buddhism, this is something that I had a hard time reconciling my Buddhistic training with my yogic training, because at first I thought Buddhism was atheistic. It isn't. It's non-theistic. Daido was adamant about that. He said, Buddhism is not atheistic. It doesn't say there is no God. It's non-theistic, which either means, because I take that one of two ways, maybe both. He said, it doesn't get involved with theorizing about God. It's more concerned with direct experience. But it also may imply that Buddhism, to some extent, just doesn't believe in a personal God. Because if you look at, there's a fantastic book, if you want to go into this, which I just discovered a few months ago by D.T. Suzuki, who brought Zen to the West, really. You can get this online if you do a search on this. D.T. Suzuki, Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist. And an extraordinary little work where he's talking about, in particular, Meister Eckhart, the German, I think it's 13th century Christian theologian and preacher and mystic. And he's talking about the fact that when you study the Christian mystics, the true Christian mystics and their deeper writings, there's essentially no difference between them and what the Buddhists say. So we tend to think, well, Christianity is so different from Buddhism because Christianity is theistic. But when you read the writings of teachers like Meister Eckhart, and they talk about the negative God or the God beyond God and the Godhead versus the God creator and all this, you realize you're getting into territory that's really very similar to what the Buddhists talk about, just a different nomenclature. And Suzuki railed against people that misunderstood the concept of emptiness. It's the single most misinterpreted principle in Buddhism, I think, because people think it's some sort of nihilistic void. And it isn't. Suzuki used to talk about something, he had a fascinating phrase, eternal motherhood. He talked about the fact that when you get to that higher point in your meditations, you come to that extraordinary sense of innate love and bliss that is exuding from the universe. That's maybe the wrong way to put it, but I think you know what I mean, that is exuding from the source. And so, again, I want to emphasize, I don't think there is the difference between systems that there seem to be on the surface of things. I need to take a drink of water. Hold on one second. So now, let's start to wrap this up. What are the key principles that we've talked about in these 6 classes? And what are the key principles of the esoteric tradition? And I would boil it down to a few things. Others might disagree slightly, but I think this is a reasonable outline. Maybe the most important one of all is the notion that you are gods. You are all gods. Ye are gods is the phrase you sometimes hear in the Christian tradition. The idea that you are not just these lifeless creations of God, you are, in a sense, also independent gods unto yourselves. Self-existent ones is the term that Shelley used to use. And you have all the potentials of God. And I debated whether to relate this or not, but maybe it's useful. Someone asked me in a meditation class a while ago, what's the single most important experience you've ever had in meditation? And I had to answer by saying it wasn't in a state of meditation. It was when I was 18 or 19, And I was walking down the street, this is when I lived in Oak Park, walking down Chicago Avenue, and I just read some yoga book, and it was talking about God, and I started thinking about, if God is omnipresent, if God is everywhere, whatever God is exactly, then I realized, I started thinking, well, that means then I have to be a part of that I can't be outside of that. There is no outside of God, so to speak. And that led to a chain of thoughts which I can't quite recreate for you. But it led to a point of realizing that I am God, not in the sense of me exclusively, but in the sense that every point within God is equally God, and therefore there is no person that is not God in that holographic way we talked about. Every point is the center. And Shelley used to quote that old classical axiom. It's attributed to various classical writers and thinkers, but the essence of it is that God is a circle whose circumference, I might get this backwards, hold on one second. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. In other words, every point is the center. And it's funny because that's in a sense what Einstein's relativity talked about in a scientific sense. This idea that every observer in a certain respect becomes the center of the universe. And so that led to a series of ideas as I was walking along. And for me, it was maybe the single most profound experience of my life. And I'm not trying to say for a moment that it was enlightenment, but it was like a small taste of, I think, what enlightenment suggests in terms of that sense of your own divinity. I felt a sense of empowerment as though I, like everybody else, had a direct line to that source, a direct line to that creative source. And it was almost like I could move mountains if I wanted to. And that lasted for all of 2 weeks, after which I came back to normal thinking consciousness. But for 2 weeks I was on cloud nine, just sort of relishing this sense of extraordinary power. And I don't mean that in a Nietzschean sense. I mean that simply in the sense of realizing that I'm not separate from that creative source, from that godlike source. And along with that, I think, though this wasn't part of my experience, along with that was what Shelley continually emphasized, that we are eternal, that we're going to be around, we've been around forever, we'll be around forever. And I remember when Kriyananda talked about going to Shelley, and when he first studied with Shelley, and he was saying how he wanted to build a temple and wanted to change the world and all this. And Shelley's almost comical remark, though it was a mystical remark, he said, "What's the hurry? You've got all of eternity. Why are you in such a hurry to do all this?" And he wasn't discouraging Kriyananda from doing it. He wanted Kriyananda to look at what the compulsion was as to why do you do what you do, continually examining your motivations. That's something that you see in all these different traditions, the Gurdjieff tradition, the Zen tradition, the mindfulness tradition. Watch your thoughts, neti. Watch why you do what you do, but that's usually never for the reasons you think. But what Shelley was adding to that mix was this idea that you're going to be around forever and ever. So if you don't achieve your dream in this lifetime, sooner or later you're going to get it. There's a certain relief that comes with that when you realize that, as far as you don't feel the compulsion. You may still go after your dream, but it's not out of this sort of manic, karmic drive. It's out of a choice. Do as thou wilt. It's one of the ideas that is misunderstood in Western occultism. Which leads me to the next point, which is another key principle of the esoteric tradition that comes along with all of this is the importance of self-mastery. And by that I'm talking about gaining control over your own universe, gaining control over your emotions, over your thoughts. The way that some mystics talk about it is that the undisciplined mind is your worst enemy, the disciplined mind is your best friend. And that until you have that sense of discipline, you're basically very enslaved, not only by the external universe, but by your inner chakras, by your inner compulsions, and certainly by your karmic predispositions. Along with that, then another key principle, I would say, of the esoteric path is you are the universe. It's the countenance beholding countenance principle. You're looking at the universe and you think it's something somehow separate from you, but in a state of awakening you realize that you're not separate. One of the phrases is, you're not apart from nature, you are a part of nature. And you could maybe tinker with that a little bit and say that you're not apart from God, you are a part of God, however you choose to define that. We'll get back to that quote in a second. Another key idea of the esoteric path is balance. Balancing out the absolute and the relative, balancing out the higher spiritual realities and insights and awakenings with the practical necessities. When I was at the monastery, one of the most powerful dialogues that I saw was when Daido was discussing the balance of the relative and the absolute during one of his Dharma dialogues. And he was talking to one of his students there, one of the senior students. And he was trying to convey this, and he related a story of, there was a Dharma brother of his, Tetsugen, whose given name was Bernard Glassman. He's still teaching out of New York, I believe. He's quite well known. He works with Jeff Bridges and various people. And Bernard Glassman was going before Daido's and his teacher, Maizumi Roshi, who was from Japan. And Maizumi Roshi posed this question to the group, the Sangha. What is mother? And everybody wondered, as you usually wonder with these cryptic teachers, what in the world does he mean? He obviously means something very subtle, and each of the students came up, as happens in Dharma combat, where teacher challenges you and you challenge the teacher, and you try to get to the root of what he's saying to try to show you have insight. And these various students were filing up in front of him and giving these very abstract, very profound answers, but they weren't the answers he was looking for. And finally, Bernard Glassman came up before Maizumi Roshi and gave a beautifully eloquent but very abstract Zen answer. And Maizumi finally said, he looked at Tetsugen and Bernard Glassman, and there were tears running down his cheek, and he said, no, this is mother. That's a very profound teaching, the idea that, no, you can go off into your abstract notions of mother doesn't really exist, you could even say, from a standpoint of emptiness. Everything is interconnected, so there is no independent mother. Well, that's BS. There is an independent mother from the standpoint of conventional truth. And so, on a certain level, feeling sadness or pain in the wake of your mother's passing, for example, is the spiritual response. Because you're honoring the realm, the coin of the realm, so to speak. It's kind of like when Jesus made that comment, a very mystical comment about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto, how does that go, God, what is God? Something like that. It's that idea of you have to balance that out, balancing out the different realms. And that's also a question of balancing out love versus knowledge. When you read these accounts of people who have near-death experiences, one of the ideas that many of them bring back is when they go before the being of light and they're quizzed about what did you learn, one of the comments that you often hear is that there's two questions that they're asked. What did you learn and how well did you love? It's not one or the other, it's both. And if you ask your average New Ager what's more important, love or knowledge, 90% will say love, of course. But Daido had a great story. He said that one winter, the winter was so bad up near the monastery in the Catskills that people thought the deer that were trying to survive in the woods were going to die from starvation because there was seemingly no food. So they banded together, they pooled their resources, hired a helicopter to drop bales of hay into the middle of the woods, at which point the deer ate the hay and promptly all died. And the reason was they had gotten used to eating the bark off of the trees, and their stomachs could not acclimate to eating the hay. And what Dido was trying to say, because this came up in a conversation about love versus knowledge, he said love is important. But if you don't have the wisdom to guide it properly, it can cause more problems than otherwise. So there's a certain balance to be struck between information and knowledge and love, compassion, knowing how to apply the compassion. Now, another point, the point that I want to wrap things up on here is it's a seemingly very simple one, and it's something that I have heard repeatedly from mystics like Shelley and Kriyananda and Dido, and if you remember that Zen story about eating the strawberry, and you might express it as enjoy life, savor life. There was a woman that sat in on this class last week that had a near-death experience, and she's not here tonight, but I asked her, I really wanted to know as much about the experience as possible, and it was only about 10 minutes long, but you could see a lot in 10 minutes in these near-death experiences. And she talked about one of the most astonishing things. There were two things that stood out for her about this near-death experience that you often hear with NDEs. One was when she crossed over there, she found herself in this beautiful green field there, which she didn't meet any beings consciously, which is a little unusual. But she said she felt this sense of overwhelming peace. That's a very common feature of these experiences and of higher mystical states, of a sense of the peace that goeth before all understanding. But the other side of it was, and she didn't want to come back to her body, it's kind of uncanny how often these people describe, they might have 5 starving kids back home, and yet they're reluctant to go back because it's so peaceful, and they almost feel like, well, they're going to be okay. And I don't know if that's always true. But she said that looking back at her everyday life from the perspective of that higher realm, she said what struck her was how utterly inconsequential the things that she worried about in her life were. Paying the bills, or what the neighbors said, or getting ahead. The things that were so important in her earthly life were meaningless from the standpoint of the higher perspective. And so a person will spend their whole life in the hamster wheel, so to speak, in the rat race, going after something, only to realize they forgot to stop and smell the roses. You hear that time and again from these teachers that it is important to savor every moment. It's important to enjoy life. And even more importantly, but even more difficult, enjoy yourself. I asked Kriyananda once, what is the most difficult challenge you've had in your entire life? And he thought a long time before he asked it. This was in a group format. He was talking out here in Oswego to some of his disciples. And he thought about it for a good minute, and he said, he was very honest, he said, learning to accept himself was the hardest challenge of his life. You hear that even from some great mystics, that learning how to not be so self-judgmental, not to hold yourself to such a high standard that you actually develop self-loathing. I posted something online a week or two ago. It's an idea that self-loathing is the ultimate narcissism. You can get too caught up in yourself. You can get too focused on self, on me in a negative way, just like you can in a positive way. And so what I'm really saying here is self-acceptance, non-judgmentality, learning to have as much compassion for yourself as you have for a child or for a pet. You might have a puppy come in the house and it urinates on the floor, and you don't beat it. I mean, if you're halfway sane or sensitive, you look at it with compassion, and yet it's very hard to look at ourselves with that same kind of acceptance and compassion. But that's something that is, I think, a really critical part of the mystical path on a practical sort of level. Now, well, we're just about there. I want to close with a couple of quotes here, and then if you have any questions, this might be the time to write them down before we wrap up. This is the single most important quote that I carried away from Dido at the monastery. This is one that I go back to and look at almost every month. Your life is in the moment. Miss the moment and you miss your life. It's a critical idea. And, staying inside the moment, learning how to savor the strawberry, so to speak. And there's one other quote here, which is from my late friend Georg Feuerstein, which is a wonderful quote. To be presently happy, rather than to seek to become happy, is an open option for all of us in every single moment. That's something to ponder. Now, are there any questions? We are probably going to have another course. I don't think we're going to go to a level 2 of this class, but we probably will sometime in the next couple of months start up another webinar here dealing with synchronicity. I've taught it here before. I always mix things up and change things around, so it wouldn't be the same as before, but we will notify all of you if we wind up doing that. I do have a website if you need to contact me. That's, did I put the web address here? Well, that's my book. I go into a lot of these ideas in my first book, The Waking Dream, so if you want to pick up on your own some of these threads, I think that book might be one way to go. That's the website address. And you can contact me through the email address that's on that site. And any last questions or comments before we wrap up here? We do have some very powerful energies in April, by the way. There's a grand cross of planetary forces, and I think that it could shake things up a bit in terms of some turbulence in the world scene, maybe in our lives, but there's also, with these major energies, very profound breakthroughs. So I would say that the next 4 to 6 weeks are really a powerful time for engaging more intensely in spiritual practice and meditation and dream work. And watch the news. I think you could see some pretty major stories in terms of breakthroughs, whether it be in science or archaeology or possibly politics. I'm a little concerned about the Crimea, but not that concerned. But, we'll see. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks so much for taking part, and namaste.